Angle, the easiest way to explain a reference angle is it's the shortest distance to the x-axis. That's it. So if you have an angle, the shortest distance back to the x-axis is your reference angle. Okay? So we're going to find the reference angle for these three examples. So 330 degrees, let's start with that. So for 330, a 330 degree angle, and these are just Google images that I found that might be helpful, maybe not. Sometimes it's confusing, I don't know. But these are some of the formulas for a reference angle. This is just an image of what they look like, but I am going to explain it, so you may not, this may not be helpful, I don't know. Okay. 330 degrees. So 330 degrees would be about here. It's in quadrant 4. So if you rotate like that, this represents a 330 degree angle. The reference angle is the shortest distance back to the x-axis. So the shortest distance back to the x-axis would be this portion right here in yellow. That is your reference angle. So if the red represents 330 degrees, what do you think the measure of that yellow piece would be? 30. That is your reference angle. How do we get that? 360 minus 330. If you're in quadrant 4, it's 360 minus the angle. That is your reference angle. So 30 degrees is the answer to part A. That's your reference angle. So because 30 degrees is your reference angle, that's telling us every angle on the unit circle that has a reference angle of 30 degrees is going to have the same sine or cosine. Now, it could change from positive to negative, but it's going to be the same. Okay? That's part A. So let's look at part B. So for part B, we are rotating clockwise. So we're going this direction. So it's going to be like about here. So this would represent my negative 120 degree. And again, the reference angle would be the shortest distance back to x. So that would be this part here in yellow. So see if you can figure out what the measure of that angle would be. So anybody have any ideas what it would be? Hazel? 60. 60 degrees. Because we know half of a circle is 180, right? So 120 back to the top of 180. 180 minus 120 would give you 60. So your reference angle is 60 degrees. And that's it. That's your reference angle. So a negative 120 has the same reference as a 60 degrees. So any angle that's 60 degrees, we're going to have the same cosine and sine, except just depending on where it falls on the unit circle, it could change to a positive or negative. All right, let's do our last one, 135. So 135. I'm going to rotate this way. So this is 135 degrees. And then take a second to find your reference angle. So for this one, it would be 180 minus 35. And that would be a 45-degree reference angle. And that is what a reference angle is. So when you look at your quiz review that I just passed out, if you look at number 4, it's asking you to find the reference angle. And that is what we just talked about. Okay, so let's finish out 6.3. So take a second and copy down example B, and we're going to work through it together. So this one, it actually tells us what quadrant we're in. So it told us we're in quadrant 3. And that's important because in quadrant 3, the only thing that is positive in quadrant 3 is tangent and cotangent. Okay. So they told us the sine is negative 5 over 3. Sine is opposite over hypotenuse. We need to figure out the adjacent. And we're going to do that using the Pythagorean Theorem. So remember, in the Pythagorean Theorem, hypotenuse has to be c. So 13 squared equals opposite squared plus a squared. I'm just using a for adjacent. All right, let's go ahead and solve that. Now, you won't be able to use a calculator, so I wouldn't even have your calculator out. So just kind of, I know it's an adjustment, but you'll be okay. Does anyone know what 13 times 13 is? That's 169. And then 5 times 5, 25. So now we're going to subtract 25. (144) equals a squared. 144 is a perfect square. And the square root is 12. So we just figured out that 12 is my adjacent side. So I now know all 3 sides. I know, and I ignore, even though that it says the opposite is negative 5, I tend to just ignore the positive and negatives. And I just put that in at the very end. So I'll explain what I mean by that here in a second. So we know that on this triangle, let me just write it out, that 5 is the opposite. We just figured out that 12 is my adjacent. And 13 is my hypotenuse. Okay, so I'm going to use these 3 to write my ratios, the last 5 ratios. So let's get started. So I'm going to start, I think the easiest to start would be cosecant of theta. We need to figure that out. We need to know the cosine of theta. and the sister to cosine, which is secant. And then we need to find tangent, and the sister to tangent, which is cotangent. Okay. So we know sine. So the easiest to find would be cosecant. So we're going to take that sign and flip it. So instead of 5 over 13, it becomes 13 over 5. Cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse. So adjacent is 12. The hypotenuse is 13. The secant is the reciprocal, so that would be 13 over 12. Tangent is opposite over adjacent. Cotangent is 12 over 5. So now that we have our ratios, let's go back in and put in our negatives. Of these 5, the only 2 that can stay positive is tangent and cotangent. So I need to make the cosecant negative, cosine needs to be negative, and so does the secant. And that would be my 5 remaining trig ratios. So I didn't put the little image up this time on purpose. So one of the things I try to give you a lot of little acronyms. So all students take calc. And that just kind of helps you remember what's positive. So in quadrant 1, everything is positive, because you do need to know which quadrant we're in. So I know quadrant 1, everything is positive. Quadrant 2, the sign is positive. Quadrant 3, T stands for tangent, is positive. And quadrant 4, cosine is positive. So it told me the cotangent is 4 over 3, and that's a positive 4 over 3. So that tells me that I am either going to be in 1 or 3, because that's the places where tangent, because if cotangent is positive, so is tangent. So that was the first clue. So that helped me knock out so I know it's not 2 or 4. So then the second thing it says is that the cosine is less than 0. Well, numbers that are less than 0 are negative. So what this is saying is that the cosine of theta is negative. So that's the 2 clues that it gave me. So in other words, it's saying figure out what quadrant has a tangent that is positive and a cosine that is negative. So which one would that be? Has to be 3. Okay, because in quadrant 1, everything is positive. So if this was flipped the other direction, if it says cosine is greater than 0, then I would have stayed in quadrant 1. But it says cosine is less than 0, so that knocks out quadrant 1. So I know I'm in quadrant 3, and that's really important, because in quadrant 3, the only thing that is positive is tangent and cotangent. That's what's positive. So we need to find the third side. Okay, so cotangent is adjacent. It's the opposite of tangent. So tangent is opposite over adjacent. Cotangent is adjacent over opposite. So adjacent over opposite. So we need to find which side. Which side are we missing? Hypotenuse. So we're going to do the Pythagorean Theorem so we can figure out the hypotenuse. Hypotenuse is C. So C squared equals 4 squared plus 3 squared. So take a minute. This is a Pythagorean triple, so you may know this without doing the Pythagorean Theorem. But if not, just do the Pythagorean Theorem. Find C. So you should have gotten 5. So your hypotenuse is 5. And I showed the work over here if you need to reference that. So I just, because, I like to write it out. So I know that adjacent is 4. I know my opposite is 3. And I know the hypotenuse is 5. We need to find the last 5 ratios. So the last 5 ratios would be the tangent of theta. Then we need to find the sine and the cosine. And then I need to find the sister to sine, which is the cosecant. And the sister to cosine, which is the secant. So take a couple of minutes and see if you can find those 5. And then we'll put our negatives in at the end. And then there's that Sohcahtoa. I don't know if you all remember that from geometry, or that's another acronym to help you remember which sides. So Sohcahtoa. So what that represents is sine. Sine is, S is for sine, that's opposite over hypotenuse. The C is cosine, that's adjacent over hypotenuse. And the T is tangent, opposite over adjacent. So that's just another acronym that's kind of popular in for our trig ratio. So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to find these 5. And then I'll give you the answers. Oops, I'm so sorry. I hit the wrong thing. All right, so I think the easiest to start with would be the sister of cotangent. So if cotangent is 4 over 3, that means tangent is going to be 3 over 4. Sine is opposite over hypotenuse. So opposite is 3, hypotenuse is 5. And then the cosecant is the reciprocal of that. So that becomes 5 over 3. Cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse. So adjacent is 4, hypotenuse is 5. And then secant is the reciprocal of that. So So now what I'm going to do, because I'm in quadrant 3, the only two that can be positive in quadrant 3 are tangent and cotangent. So this one is going to stay positive because that was positive. And tangent is going to be positive. But these 4, we need to put a negative sign in front. So they're negative. So I'm going to put my negatives in, negative, negative, a negative, and a negative. And that is your remaining values. So we're going to do one more question tomorrow, but that's actually it for today. Tomorrow we're going to do one last example because I don't think I could squeeze it in. I don't want to rush through it. Homework 2 is due today on Canvas. Homework 3 you will submit in class on paper. So that one you'll just give me in class on paper. If you have questions, this is a good time to come up. And that's it.